gives us knowledge of the will and relations of the divine to the human. But I asked, why do you call it an allegory? Is it not a record of the real facts of God's dealings with man? Why, certainly not, he replied. That were impossible. But why impossible? I persisted. Simply because there is no possible basis for such real facts. Where is your Egypt and Palestine and Jerusalem and Babylon in real life? Where is your Dead Sea and Mount Sinai and Rome and Athens? He gave me a look of pitying triumph. Where? I retorted. Well, somewhat confused by his confident air, bluffed, as we say in America, why they are where they have always been, of course. Egypt is in Africa, Palestine is in Asia, Rome is in Italy, and Athens is in Greece. What's the matter with you anyhow? Been eating prunes? So, my brother, with a commiserating leer, do you cover one impossibility with another? Where then is your Africa, Asia, Italy, and Greece? Where are they? I replied, still further confused by his domineering insistence. Why, they are where they have always been too, of course. Well, my brother, you ask me to teach you, yet you appear to know far more than I do. I have been through every province of the country, and have circumnavigated its coast, and have failed to find these places, or anything answering to them. Why, man, I exclaimed in amazement, they are not in the Iron Republic, but on the other side of the world. I tell you, I have been through all and around it, said he contemptuously, and I repeat, they do not exist. What? I asked, being now convinced that the man was daft. Do you mean to say that there is no world beyond the confines of this Iron Republic? I mean to say that this is the world, and if there is any other, it has never been discovered. Why, my friend, I exclaimed, your own histories must record the fact that this country was settled by colonists from England as late as the 16th century? Lies, said he, snapping his fingers contemptuously. Scholastic lies to deceive the credulous and make foundation for evil practices. The children of the truth know better. Now see here, I said, warming up and getting interested in spite of the whole thing. You have literature, hundreds of books, histories, philosophies, poems that were written in other countries. How then can you deny their existence? Lies all, he replied, waving his hands scornfully as if to brush them out of the way. All lies, my brother. You have had ships and men come here from America during your lifetime. There are men here now that were born in that country. All lies, he reiterated. Cunningly devised fables to deceive the unwary, but the children of the truth know better. The devil. I'm from America myself. Lies, all thunderation, I cried, seizing him by the collar, yanking him out of the seat. Do you mean to call me a lie? Help! Help! He shouted lustily. This man is crazy! You yourself are crazy, you infernal old loon, I shouted, shaking him all over the seats. Friends, fellowmen, save me! Save me from the clutches of this maniac! He appealed to the other passengers. Come and take this damned old lunatic off my hands, I shouted, still holding on to him. And so, as we surged back and forth, and other passengers began climbing over seats to get to us, a gong sounded, and a moment later a car ran down on the side opening at Aegea, and the doors flew open. We must have been 1,500 feet above the earth, and from that high altitude had a most magnificent view. Mountains could be seen in the blue distance, and rivers winding through sunny fields, with here and there a lake that flashed like silver. Many towns and villages were visible from where we floated. High up in midair, trains of cars far below us looked like great black jointed worms. crawling swiftly along the earth, and the crispness of the rarefied atmosphere would have chilled us but for the exercise of driving the great double airplane. It was exhilarating to the highest degree as we swung around in great ascending circles or hurtled quivering down through the air in long toboggan slides to leap up again as through sprung from a catapult when the steering fan was dipped. Helen Morris never looked more beautiful than as we swung side by side under the aeroplane and surveyed the panorama of the earth below. During the year of our acquaintance, I had made no more progress in loving or love-making than on the first day we met. Always kind, sympathetic, and sometimes almost tender, she nevertheless held me at a worshipful distance, never repulsing, but always repressing me in a way that convinced me that my suit was not disagreeable, but hopeless. No slighting reference had been made to Professor Hallam since the day when, in her impetuous argument with her father, she sneered at the fiddlers of Ironia, and indeed, her conduct afterwards indicated repentance for her hasty and unjust words, for in her subsequent manner towards him in my presence she seemed desirous to make atonement by being especially kind. She was interested in me, that I was sure of, and when I achieved some notoriety by winning somewhat famous Gangplow case against the state, and began to talk about a brilliant attorney from America, her elation was so sincere and apparent as to give me the hope that I had won two suits at the same time. But when I would have improved the occasion to press my claim for her heart and hand, she protested, declaring with tears that I gave her great pain, and begged me to desist. Notwithstanding, she seemed to be happier with me than with the Professor Hallam, and I reached the conclusion after close observation that her hand had been promised to him, and that she was too proud or too true to draw back when she found that her heart could not be given with it. I had yielded to my fate, and while improving every opportunity to bask in her presence, I no more spoke of my love. But this glorious afternoon I found it hard to repress the promptings of my heart. She looked so happy, and all nature seemed so glad, that I could not bring myself to feel that I was a finally rejected lover. The novelty and delight of my position made me again to doubt the reality of it all, and looking into her eyes that beamed as tender as the blue sky above us, I said, "This must be heaven materialized and modernized." "If so, then a good many features were eliminated in the process," replied my companion. "I care not what is lacking, so long as the feature which makes it heaven is here," I said, looking straight into her deep brown eyes. "And pray what is that?" she asked. "The angelic. But for the testimony of the good book, which records that he was cast out, I would be tempted to retort that Lucifer is also an evidence," she replied, blushing and laughing. "His was a sad fate," said I, "but not so sad as mine, for he was shut out forever from the sight of his bliss, which he had lost, while I, alas, must endure the double grief of losing what is more than heaven to me, and then seeing another enjoy what I have lost." She blushed deeply and dropped her eyes before my ardent gaze, and then, turning her head, looked away towards the blue hills that broke the northern horizon. "After all," she said, and speaking as much to herself as to me, "after all, the Christian philosophy teaches that the real heaven and true peace, which is above all earthly passion, is as much the fruit of sacrifice as of love." And turning her eyes full upon me, perverse and impulsive as I am sometimes, I yet believe that I am capable of suffering rather that I should be the wilful cause of suffering in another. I began vehemently to protest against any philosophy that would make two people miserable for the chance of making one happy, when my ear caught the sound of a wavering melody above us, which seemed to come down from heaven itself. "Hark!" "What is that sweet sound?" My companion listened a moment, and then her face clouded. "Don't you know? That's Professor Hallam and his Colean harp following us. Let's dip." And jerking the steering fan with all her force, we flew down an aerial incline 500 feet or more with such velocity as almost to take my breath. In making these dips or downward glides, only a slight inclination is necessary to send the airplane whizzing through the air with the speed of an arrow, but my companion, either with reckless abandon or by accident, threw our machine down almost to an angle of 45 degrees, and when at the bottom of the incline the head was thrown up to make it leap into the air again, the great airplane bellied upward with a strain that made the frame bend and quiver, and then with the report like a crack of a pistol it burst, almost from end to end, and seeming to shudder for a moment began to drop towards the earth. In this moment of deadly peril, I believed that all was best and noblest in me asserted itself like a flash. It occurred to me that the rent canvas, while not sufficient to bear up two, would probably drop gently enough with one to avoid fatal consequences. With the thought came the resolve, and in less than a second after the airplane began to fall, I had thrown loose the strap that bound me to my seat, and rising upon the pedal, leaned over until my lips almost touched the blanched face of the woman I loved, and shouted, for the whipping of the rent canvas made a noise like that of a hurricane. "It is death for one, and I love you and can die for you." "Then let it be death for both," she cried, letting go of the bar and throwing both arms around my neck, with a vice-like grip, "for I love you and I cannot leave without you. One kiss, oh my darling," pressing my lips to hers with a thrill that made me forget the peril of death, and then, throwing myself forward, dropped from the pedal. But the fair arms around my neck were strong, and though I struggled to break loose, knowing that the velocity at which we were falling meant certain death for both of us, they held me fast. Down, down we fell, with a quivering, fluttering motion like a winged bird dropping to the earth. And choked to blindness and suffocation, I was expecting to feel the impact that would crush us against the ground, when I became dimly conscious of a fierce shrieking sound above us, and then our downward motion seemed to be arrested. A moment later we struck the earth with a shock that seemed to break every bone in my body. With a great wave of thankfulness, I realized that we were saved, and disengaging the fair arms that still wound around my neck like hands of steel, I struggled to my feet and hastened, unbuckling the strap that bound the beautiful form of my heart's idol to the wrecked machine, dragged her fainting from under the airplane. My first concern was to ascertain if she were killed or injured, and laying her gently in the grass, I found to my unspeakable joy that she was alive and bore no marks of injury. Losing the close-fitting bodice at the throat that she might breathe more freely, and fanning her vigorously with my handkerchief, I was rewarded in a few moments by seeing her open her eyes and look up at me with an expression of inexpressible tenderness. "Oh, my love," she said, holding up her hands to me, "then you would indeed have died for me." "1,000 times," I cried, rapturously, seizing her hands and covering them with kisses. "Now you shall be mine forever and ever." "No, no, it cannot be," she exclaimed hastily, withdrawing her hands and springing to her feet. "What does this mean?" running back to the airplane with an expression of terror. I followed her and saw with astonishment that another airplane was foul with ours and lay upon it. "What indeed?" I cried, seizing the end of it and lifting it up. "Oh, can't you see? That's Professor Hallam's. Don't you see his harp? Oh my God!" And with a shuddering cry of horror, she covered her face with her hands and fell upon her knees, moaning and crying. Then it dawned upon me that the noble man had swooped down and attached his machine to ours, had thrown himself to death to save our lives. Leaving the weeping woman, I ran to a group of people who had gathered some little distance away and were talking and gesticulating wildly, and there, crushed and dead, lay the noblest man and greatest genius that ever lived. In his godlike nobility of soul, he had caught our aeroplane at several hundred feet above the earth, and seeing that it could not sustain all and prevented us from being crushed against the earth, he had thrown himself down to a horrible death that his affianced might escape with his rival. I wonder not that at last, when earthly passion had been chilled by the cold touch of death, and the dross of mortality scarce intervened, that it was of him that she thought, that it was the wondrous melody of his nocturne that she heard above the roaring and frozen sea, rolling down from the beyond where she passed. And I felt no pang of jealousy. Hallam in the house of many mansions, where there is no marrying and giving in to marriage, but all are as the angels of God in love and purity, I may be accounted worthy of the humblest station in their sphere. I shall be content. And yet she loved me and not him. Kneeling by him, I raised the noble head and chafed the poor broken hands that held within them the potency of such divine harmony as the world will never hear again. But the great soul had passed. Death was doubtless instantaneous, for though his face was unmarred, his body was horribly crushed and broken. Dispatching one of the bystanders to convey the intelligence of the accident to the city, I went back and raised the weeping girl who was to have been the dead man's wife. "My darling," I said, lifting her gently, "you would have been true to him, and he was a godlike man and worthy of your troth. But surely the hand of Providence is in this terrible thing. Will you go and look upon him?" Taking my arm without speaking, I led her to where our Savior lay upon the ground, and with a solemn grace and dignity that was really majestic, she walked around to the dead man's feet and looked long and calmly at his face. "You were too pure and too great to be loved as a man," she spoke at last, "and in the presence of the dead clay, I feel as unworthy as Guinevere at the feet of the pure and royal Arthur. Alas, the world has lost its greatest spirit, and I a friend of whom I could never be worthy." Then, as I led her away, "O my Lancelot, thou art not and never can be so good or great a man, and yet I love you." For months my beautiful wife had been fading like a flower, even on a shipboard, and amid the excitement of the wildest storm, she seemed listless and totally indifferent to her surroundings. The hooding sadness that began to come upon her after the terrible accident that resulted in the death of Professor Hallam never left her, and while she sometimes simulated vivacity, her gaiety pained rather than pleased me, for my love penetrated her sweet little deception, and I knew that it was for my sake that she pretended what she did not truly feel. I had fondly hoped, and so had her parents, that when she was out of the country and away from the scenes that reminded her of the past, her old buoyancy of spirits would return. Indeed, but for this and the dreadful melancholy that grew up around her day after day, we would never have yielded to her desire to undertake the desperate journey to America. But it was not so, and the bitterness of my disappointment amounted to anguish. Every morning on board of the vessel, as on shore, she would awake at the exact moment when the wonderful matinees of Professor Hallam had been rolled out from the Tower of Music, and listen whirl-eyed with every faculty strained at the utmost tension of alertness, listening, and as I lay beside her sometimes and held her hand, feigning sleep, I could feel the nervous tremor that agitated her while her pulse fluttered with the intensity of the nervous strain. My God, it was terrible that my sweet wife, the most beautiful and gracious woman I ever knew, and the only one I ever loved, should suffer like that. And at sunset she would listen for the nocturne with the same fever of excitement. Thus, as long as we were in latitudes where day and night alternated, and when we reached the regions of the pole where there were no sunrisings nor settings, instead of becoming better, she grew worse, and this intense, preoccupied, listening attitude became habitual. I employed every artifice I could devise to interest her and fix her attention on objects about us, and she, with the sweetest grace, tried to be interested, but even as I held her hand and talked to her with all the animation I could affect, looking into the fathomless depths of her glorious eyes, I would lose her. With the most intense concentration of mind, she would follow me and sense what I was saying for a few minutes, and then she listened indeed, but not to me, and oh, she tried so hard. One evening we stood by the rail on the quarter-deck looking out over the hissing brine at the sun which hung red upon the horizon. It seemed as if it were just ready to sink out of sight, though really it had been but slightly above the horizon for many days. As I stood with one arm around her and holding her hand, her gaze was fixed on the red ball of fire that touched the ocean's rim, and which was reflected in her eyes like the flashes in an opal. I drew her to me and spoke ardently of what I hoped to accomplish when we reached my own country, even putting my face against hers as I spoke, but I don't think she heard me. Like one hypnotized, she seemed totally oblivious of her surroundings, and I saw with a pang of anguish that she was listening for the strains of that glorious nocturne, such as was never heard except from the Tower of Music, and such as was never played by any hand save that of the dead master. And then I believed my heart broke. Then a pain struck through my breast that has never ceased from that hour to this, waking or sleeping. Dropping her hand, I fell forward with a groan, and catching the rail, she rested my head upon it. Starting as if she had been struck, my darling came back to herself, and with a cry fell down at my feet, and with torrent of broken words and sobs begged me to forgive her. "Oh, my love," she cried as the tears ran down her upturned face, "my heart is breaking for you, but I can't help it, indeed I cannot. Oh, when I cannot see you or hear you, my heart aches for you, but with never-ceasing misery. I have struggled and I've prayed, but God will not help me, and I have feared that you might not understand, that you might think, oh, how do I say this? That you might not think that I love you and you only with all my heart. Oh, my husband, pity me and forgive your poor, miserable, unfortunate wife." Oh, and she fell forward with her face against my knees, sobbing and quivering with the violence of her emotion. Lifting her gently in my arms while my heart was bursting, I carried her down to the cabin and laid her on the bed with her arms still about my neck as when they held me back from a fearful death that summer afternoon. I fell on my knees by the bedside and with my face against hers wept with her. And in the dim twilight of the cabin, while the sun hung red upon the rim of the sea, and the billows rustled along the vessel's side with a sad murmur like the sighing of an autumn wind, she told me that Professor Hallam's music had always impressed her in a way that she couldn't understand, that whenever she heard his wonderful matins and nocturnes, she seemed to lose herself and was borne away on the billows of harmonious sound. She told me that she could even divine the music in advance of playing, and knew each bar before she heard it as well as if she had composed it herself. Stranger than all, she said, she always knew by some mysterious influence the very moment the music was going to begin, and she knew by that influence, that mysterious something, that the master was playing now, was playing all the time, and while she could not bear the music by this strange power which dominated her, she felt it and knew what unutterable strains were being rendered in heaven or somewhere. She told me as she lay there with her soft arms about my neck and her dear face touching mine, that if she had the skill to set it down fast enough, she could write the grand music that was being rendered day and night and day after night without cessation. At first she said she only felt it in evenings and mornings, and then more and more, until finally, when we passed into the zone where there was no alternation of day and night, she felt that he was playing all the time. She could not hear it, but she felt its beauty, and could not escape its power. She had kept this from me until now. Seeing my suffering, she could no longer conceal it, but told me all, that I might not doubt her love, but pity and forgive her the pain she caused me. If she had done this at first, the great physicians of Ironia might have cured her of the malady, for such it must have been, and I entreated her to let me take her back, but then she would not consent. "Why, it has stopped now," she cried, holding my face between her hands and looking up at me with the soft light in her eyes. "It stopped straight off when you fell against the rail, and I know he would never play again, even to the angels, if he knew it caused me sorrow." And as I gazed into her face and saw the old look in her eyes, I thanked God and prayed that the spell might be broken, and that she might never again fall under the power of the dead man's music. I knew not that the end was so near, and when it came, it was as if God had struck me with a thunderbolt out of a clear sky. For a week she had not come on deck, and had scarcely been on her feet during the time. The hallucination that possessed her had not recurred since the day she told me all, and I was sure that in some inexplicable way her violent emotion at that time had been the means of breaking the spell. But the improvement I had looked for from that did not come, and she grew weaker physically, day by day, or rather from hour to hour, as there was no alternation of day and night. We've sighted Barrington Strait, and was laying off and on, keeping the towering ice wall in sight, and waiting for a wind that would drive us through the current that runs like a mill race through the channel. For hours my beautiful wife, now so frail and white as to seem almost ethereal, had reclined on the lounge in the cabin, with her eyes half closed, and such an expression of heavenly peace upon her face that I felt awed, as though in the presence of an angel. I was sitting at the table trying to fix my mind upon a chart that I was making of the ice coast and the entrance to the strait, when, with a slight cry, she clasped her hands and opened wide her eyes with that look of listening expectancy I know so well. Springing to her side with a half-uttered imprecation, I kneeled beside her and caught her clasped hands in mine. "Listen," she whispered excitedly. "He's going to play. I feel it. Ah, now he's playing. It's the glorious nocturne he played that evening when we were by the river. Hark, I can hear it. Oh, so grand." Her eyes closed, and she moved her head forward and from the side to side for some moments, keeping time. "Edward, my husband, where are you?" "I'm here, darling," I cried passionately, pressing her hands and imprinting a kiss on her partly open lips. "Then I am content." And withdrawing one of her hands from mine, she put an arm around my neck. I started to speak caressingly to her when she stopped me with a quick "Hush, I'm going to sing." He's playing the prelude. Now he's motioning to me to begin now. And inhaling a deep breath, she began to sing the great peace hymn of the Republic, which I'm not going to sing, Her voice swelled grandly and floated over the black ocean. She drew my face down upon her bosom, and as the triumphant notes of this magnificent hymn, the masterpiece of Professor Howland, rose and fell, my heart seemed to melt within me. My tears gushed forth, and I felt as if my spirit was outborne on the wings of song, far above the sphere of earthly hope and passion, beyond the sound of discord, beyond the veil of darkness, into a great luminous ethereal space that throbbed with the rhythmic measures of the music of the spheres. And as I floated upward on the waves of unutterable melody where there was no horizon and no sky, an angel held me by the hand and about the neck, and that angel I felt had been my wife. I was aroused by a touch on the shoulder, and looking up I saw the kind face of Captain Brent bending over me. "Where am I?" asked in a dazed way. "You, sir, are in the hands of Almighty God," replied the captain solemnly, "who doeth all things well." I staggered to my feet and gazed about me, and then, looking down, saw the earthly image of my wife, still and white as a reclining statue of marble. Her eyes were closed as though in slumber, and her lips were parted with a smile, and I realized that God had struck the final blow. With a calmness I could not understand, I motioned him out of the cabin and bowed myself in the presence of my dead. When I went out on deck again, the sun had disappeared below the horizon, and fingers of golden fire pointed from the rim of the black ocean to the zenith that was flushed with rosy light. But why should I linger with these sorrowful details? I was not stirred with any emotion, and felt nothing except that dull pain in my heart which has never left me. Captain Brent was like a father, and the boys pressed my hand with a silent sympathy that expressed far more than words. I say I was not moved by any great emotion except one, when, after Captain Brent had read the solemn service for those who are buried in the sea, and motioned to the mate to take me into his cabin while they committed my idol to the deep, then for a time I was crazed. I had nearly gone mad, and I believe I would have killed every man aboard the ship before I would have suffered them to cast that loved form into the cold hissing waters of that black sea. The weather was favorable, and the billows rolled over, and far up on the shelving ledge of the great berg, where we had only to ride in on the crest of a wave, and drawing the boat up, make it fast on the ice. It was a little mountain of ice and a snow, and tapering up from the water line, it terminated in two glittering pinnacles like crystal spires of a cathedral of glass. Between the two, a niche or grotto partly filled with snow, and up to this we climbed by throwing ropes over the jutting crags, and lesser pinnacles that projected from the sloping sides above the wash of the sea waves. And so we toiled up from the terrace to terrace, and from pinnacle to pinnacle, until we reached the grot between the spires, and there we placed the couch with the earthly form of my beautiful wife, and banked the snow about it. Below, the Black Sea sobbed and moaned about the base of the great iceberg, and above, the wind sang among the crevices and pinnacles of the resonant ice like 100 Achillean harps, swelling in fitful gusts until the triumphant chords rang out like strains from the tower of music. And there we left her, a marble queen upon a crystal throne, alone with God and the angels. I begged for the love of heaven to be left there with her, but, cruel in their kindness, they dragged me away to the ship. And then there burst upon us a scene of unearthly splendor. The aurora australis sprang up around us, and under it the Black Sea turned to gold, frosted here and there with the foaming crests of billows. Every rope and spar of the ship stood out white in the spectral light, and the Great icebergs in their whiteness and stillness and silence looked like ghosts, preternaturally enlarged. The twin spires of the crystal mausoleum gleamed like sapphires by the wondrous light, and irradiated by its ineffable glory was revealed the form of my lost wife. And while the amber and golden light played around the towering berg, radiating from it like a halo, fluttering like banners and angels' wings above it, we drew away until it became a mere flashing gem upon the sea of gold.